Death of a Nation, we have on the cover, well, first of all, the title, Death of a Nation. It's actually an allusion to a movie that was released almost 100 years ago exactly. In 1915, the progressive Democrat Woodrow Wilson screened a movie in the White House, the first movie ever shown in the White House called Birth of a Nation. And The Birth of a Nation is distinguished by the fact that it's a movie whose hero is the Ku Klux Klan. The KKK rides to the rescue at the end of the movie. It's a racist movie shown by a racist president. And suddenly we have a very interesting phenomenon to deal with intellectually, progressive racism. And that's kind of a surprise because we don't really get taught that, progressive racism. And yet, it would not be an exaggeration to say that progressives and Democrats invented racism. And here's what I mean, that historically the Democratic Party was the party of the slave plantation. They were unified not around racism, but around slavery. And the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats were in it together. When Abraham Lincoln identified what he called the four bad guys of slavery, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, you might say. One was Roger Taney, who wrote the Dred Scott decision. He was from Maryland. Lincoln counts him as a Southerner. But the second is Franklin Pierce, the former president from New Hampshire, a Northerner. Then James Buchanan, the sitting president from Pennsylvania, a Northerner. Then Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's supreme antagonist from Illinois, a Northerner. The point I'm trying to make is the Northern Democrats were driving the pro-slavery debate in the Democratic camp. That is camouflaged by progressive historiography, which tries to pin it on the South. No, the secession debate was in fact North-South, but the slavery debate was between the pro-slavery Democratic Party and the anti-slavery Republican Party, and that's a fact. This fact is so crushing that sometimes when I speak on campus, this is the familiar thing that happens to me. I'm talking to students at Bowdoin College or Tulane, and inevitably some professor of Romance languages will stand up and say, well, Dinesh, you are being a little tad simplistic here. You are pointing the finger of blame at the Democratic Party, but you've got to realize there's just a lot of blame to go around. Everybody was in this. And so when I hear this kind of thing, this typical squid-like cloud of rhetoric aimed at camouflaging historical reality, I like to try to find a way to dissipate it. And so I say, in 1860, this is the year before the Civil War, no Republican owned a slave. Not no Republican leader owned a slave, but no Republican in the United States owned a slave. All the slaves in the entire country, 4 million of them, were owned by Democrats. Now, the beauty of this statement, crushing as it is that it is a scientific statement. It is open to empirical refutation. All you have to do is give me the name of one Republican who owned a slave, and I would have to take it back. But to this date, no valid counterexample has been produced. A few months ago, I got an email from a guy. I'm a demographer at the University of Michigan. He goes, I got you, Dinesh. Ulysses S. Grant inherited a slave on his wife's side. A solitary slave, mind you. And I go, that's what I call an almost touché. Ulysses S. Grant did in fact inherit a slave on his wife's side, but at the time this happened, Ulysses S. Grant was a Democrat. Only later did he move over into the Republican camp. Now, here's the point. When slavery ended, the Democratic Party was in a panic. It had been organized around slavery. And so it had to figure out what's going to happen to us now. The Democrats were worried they would go the way of the Whigs. In other words, become a non-existent political party. So they decided to do something new. And they came up with racism. If we can't organize around slavery, let's organize around white supremacy. That was the whole point of showing that movie in the White House. From the Democrats' point of view, America was being born anew. That's why it's Birth of a Nation. And my argument is that if that progressive democratic philosophy, this destructive, bigoted, exploitative philosophy is carried to its logical endpoint, it will kill America. And hence my movie, Death of a Nation. And how will it kill America? It doesn't kill America by making the land go away or making the American people disappear. But you can kill a country another way, just like you can kill a person another way. You don't have to shoot them. You can kill it. If someone could take Dinesh and strip away his personality and strip away his moral compass, morally anesthetize him. By the way, this is actually what a Clinton appointee judge was trying to do to me when he sentenced me to mandatory psychiatric re-education. I think he was kind of hoping I would undergo the psychological re-evaluation and suddenly surface on MSNBC, at which point I'd be pronounced cured. But my point is that if you strip away a person's personality and their moral compass, outwardly they're the same. It's still Dinesh, but you've killed him on the inside. And you can kill a country by destroying what makes it unique. If we were to strip away the principles of the American founding, if we were to make America unrecognizable from what it is today, we will have killed America. And that is what the progressive left intends to do. Now, I turn to our movie poster, which morphs the heads of Trump and Lincoln. And this causes the left to sort of freak out. And as you know, freaking out is kind of their operating move in the Trump era. They freak out, Jim Acosta style. And they've become a group of aggressive, overgrown infants, reacting angrily. And so they go, how dare you put Trump and Lincoln together? What are you saying? Well, I'm not saying that Trump and Lincoln are the same guy. I'm not even comparing them as men. They're different, very different. Lincoln was brooding, melancholy, philosophical. Trump is, you may say, a different kind of guy. He marches to his own drum. He's even very different than Reagan. Reagan believed that you can change the world in 2, maybe 3 ways. That you need statesman-like priorities. Focus on the Soviet Empire, reducing taxes, Central America. Trump is literally a guy who's manic. He fights on every front. So he's pulling out of the trade pact, and he's fixing the court, and he's trying to push tax reform through. And what's amazing is that at the same time he's doing all this political manic energy, he's swatting Meryl Streep over here, taking on low-rating CNN. So here's a guy who's sort of fighting on the political and the cultural front both. While Trump and Lincoln are very different, however, the situations in which the two men found themselves are actually eerily similar. In 1860, an outsider, a Republican, the first Republican, Lincoln, wins the election. But it's a very close election that he was not expected to win, and the only reason he won it is there were 2 Democrats in the race who split the Democratic vote. So Lincoln comes in unexpectedly. And what happens? Well, you may say all hell breaks loose. The Northern Democrats, there are open calls for Lincoln to be assassinated, plunge the dagger into him in Democratic newspapers. And that eventually happens. Lincoln is assassinated. And the Southern Democrats are so unwilling to abide by a Lincoln presidency that they're like, we'll do whatever it takes, by any means necessary. Let's break up the country if we have to. This is the craziness that was going on in 1860. And if you have any historical perspective, this is the craziness that's going on now. People say, well, Trump is out there. He's just so extreme. He's this and he's that. Trump is not extreme. He's the product of a political extremism that brought us to this point. In other words, we are, unfortunately, not living in the Reagan era anymore. I wish we were. I wish this was an era of gentleman's politics. But it is difficult to be a gentleman when the other side has become gangsterized. The Democratic Party has become gangsterized under Obama. Jimmy Carter would no more dream of locking me up for some technical campaign finance violation than George H.W. Bush would want to lock up Michael Moore. That was the old America. But that's not the America we live in now. I think if Reagan were alive today, he would be heartbroken. Reagan counted on a certain kind of civility with the others. If Reagan made a joke, Sam Donaldson, the ABC News reporter, would laugh. Reagan and Tip O'Neill were jovial. They disagreed politically, but they got along. So we want that America back. But the big question is, how do we get it back? How do we stop the Democrats from doing what they're doing to us if we don't threaten to do it to them? I'll give an extreme example, but it's from Lincoln himself. It came to the attention of Abraham Lincoln early in the Civil War, as soon as black soldiers began to fight in the Union Army, that the Confederacy, upon apprehending Union black soldiers, would summarily execute them. Not white soldiers, who would be normal captives of war, but black soldiers would be killed. And Lincoln issued an executive order, which I consider to be the most barbaric of his presidency. He said, for every black Union soldier that is shot by the Confederacy, one Confederate soldier will be summarily executed. It is an order of almost unimaginable barbarity. But Lincoln realized, how else do we get them to stop? The only way to get them to stop is to do to them what they've been doing to us. And in fact, the practice did stop. And similarly now, how can we actually deal with the gangsterism of the left? Look, we've tried nominating one Boy Scout after another. Bob Dole, Mitt Romney, John McCain. Unbelievably clean-cut guys with amazing resumes. I mean, Mitt Romney's resume, probably the most impressive since Jesus Christ. But as soon as he steps on the public stage, within 15 minutes, the left has converted him into Lucifer. How? Mitt Romney, you are a greedy capitalist. You have $200 million, which you've got stealing off the backs of poor, hardworking people. And Romney is truly up against the wall. He doesn't know what to say. He begins to babble. This is Republican, you may say, gentility. Now, you go to Trump, you're a greedy capitalist, you've got too much. Notice no one even tries this. Why not? You've got too much money. Trump goes, sit down. You are misinformed. I have a lot more money than you think. It kind of doesn't work. It doesn't work. Now, the left is not entirely enthusiastic, you might have noticed, about my new book and movie. And so what do? Now, here we get to see the big lie kind of in action. A recent article in the Washington Post. Dinesh D'Souza has made a movie claiming that Hitler was a liberal. Now, that is what I would call the retarded moron's description of my movie. I do not claim that. Hitler was not a liberal. Hitler was not a Democrat. That's not what I say. It's very easy to erect an idiotic straw man and then knock him down. Here's what I do say, and it's 10 times more crushing. And the writer of that Washington Post article just doesn't have the guts to say it because they can't defend against it. What I do say is that the Nazis and Hitler got some of their most destructive genocidal schemes directly from American progressives and from the Democratic Party. Now, a couple of things strike one about this. I'll give an example, and we show this in the movie. There's a riveting scene in the movie where the senior Nazis who are drafting the so-called Nuremberg laws, these are the laws that make Jews into second-class citizens, they're sitting there, and they have in their hands the democratic laws of the Jim Crow South. Now, it's important to realize that every segregation law in the American South was passed by a Democratic legislature, signed by a Democratic governor, enforced by Democratic officials. There's no exception to this rule. You may not have learned it in your textbooks, but the Nazis know this, and they're holding those laws. And they realize that they can just cross out the word black and write in the word Jew, and they're home free. The Nuremberg laws, in other words, I'm saying, aren't parallel to, they are lifted from the Democratic Party's laws of the mid-20th century. This is a fact. And it's not my fact. It's documented extensively by the Yale legal scholar James Whitman in his book, Hitler's American Model. Now, that book should actually have been titled Hitler's Democratic Model. But since James Whitman is a progressive, he wants to downplay the democratic role, and so he blames America. Hitler's American model. as if all these crimes, from slavery to segregation, were done by Americans or white people. Wait a minute. There were 300,000 white guys that got killed in the Civil War who were on the right side, and there were 300,000 white guys who got killed in the war who were on the wrong side. But obviously this is not a problem of whiteness, it's a problem of slavery. So here are the Nazis using the American laws as their model. In fact, in the most delicious and sort of bizarre moment, the Nazis have a problem. They go, we have a problem. Before we can enforce these laws against Jews, we have to solve the problem of who is a Jew, the problem of racial identity. And they realize that the Democrats have adopted what's called the one-drop rule throughout the South. And if you have one drop of black blood, you're black. A single discernible trace of black ancestry makes you black. And the Nazis look at each other and they basically go, and this is the shocking part, that's too racist even for us. The Nazis think the Democrats have gone too far. And in fact, in the one-drop rule that is in the Nuremberg laws that are issued in 1935, in order to be counted as Jewish, the subject is somewhat complex, but in essence, you have to have 3 Jewish grandparents. You have to be, you may say, 75% Jewish. So the Nazis take a softer line in identifying racial identity than the Democrats. Now, if this Washington Post article had summarized what I said, they would realize there is no refutation. There's nothing that this reporter could say. In fact, probably his or her knowledge of the subject is so deficient, they wouldn't even know what to say. They haven't read any of the sources that are in my book, and this is kind of why I like to release the book with the movie. The movie is a kind of riveting, emotional, and pictorial depiction. There it is. Here are these German-speaking actors, and they're talking in German, and you feel like you're around the table in 1935. But if someone goes, where are you getting that, Dinesh? Where are you getting those conversations? I'm getting them right out of the historical transcripts that Whitman has excavated. I'm actually quoting from the historical record, except, and here's the crusher, that historical record is in to my knowledge, no high school textbook, no college textbook. It has never been on the History Channel. It has basically been suppressed by progressive historiography. Now you might ask, how is that possible? I mean, we learn a lot about the Nazis, the fascists. I mean, you turn on MSNBC, they're bloviating about fascism. Chris Matthews is talking about fascism, and so on. How is it possible to suppress information in this age of information? How can you keep intelligent people from knowing things? Well, here you got to realize that starting in the 1940s, but continuing through the 60s, progressives have increasingly come to dominate 3 fields: academia, the media, and the entertainment world. And that includes Broadway, Hollywood, the music industry, the comedians. And so ironically, there are people in America, educated people, who think they know things. Well, Dinesh, don't you know that fascism is on the right? And I'm thinking, you think you know. I know you know nothing, but how do you know the things you do? And the answer is something like this. A professor writes a book, a left-winger, at Berkeley writes a book, fascism is on the right. And 10 of his progressive colleagues go, great book. The New York Review of Books writes a laudatory review. NPR does an interview. The History Channel Michael Moore rolls in to make a documentary. Or Steven Spielberg constructs a movie. So here's what I'm getting. The ordinary educated guy goes, well, I know fascism is on the right because I've seen it everywhere. I went in Barnes & Noble, there was a book about it. I turn on the History Channel, I look it up on Wikipedia. There it is. That's how I know. Not realizing these aren't independent sources. The same bullet has been ricocheting off 10 different walls and it's coming back at you. But because you see it here and there and everywhere, you think, it's got to be true. It's got to be true. Even though it's not true. It's not true. There's a little controversy going on right now about the Nazi 25-point platform involving Donald Trump Jr. Because he goes, and this is actually really the outsider's point of view. Donald Trump Jr. looks at the Nazi 25-point platform and he says, hey, this sounds eerily similar to the platform of the Democratic Party. That is actually the voice of common sense speaking, because as you scroll through the platform, yes, there are some provisions about Jews, but the economic platform, state control of banks, state control of healthcare, state control of education, state control of religious liberty. In other words, state-run capitalism, which is the clinical economic definition of Nazism, of fascism, I should say, of fascism. And it is a clinically accurate description of the policies of Barack Obama. Why? Because under Barack Obama, the government greatly increased its control over banks, investment companies, the entire healthcare sector, every hospital, every hospice, every doctor, increasingly the energy sector. Hillary and Bernie wanted to expand government control of the education sector. Now, they're not talking about nationalizing these industries, but having them private, but quarterbacked by the state. And so, for example, you have private health insurance companies, but who tells them what to cover? The government. Who decides how much to pay? The government. That is state-run capitalism. In the early 20th century, that was known as fascism. Now, I've talked about fascism a little bit, maybe a little more than I wanted to. Today, we see fascism in Antifa. Mussolini would recognize those guys. Now, I mean, there's a part of me that doesn't want to take him too seriously. You know, these overgrown kids coming out of their mom's basement. Hey, Mom, where's my costume? My Halloween costume I'm looking for. I got to go fight Nazis. I'm like, really? The real danger, though, isn't Antifa. It is when somebody uses the weapons of the state against your political opponents, that gets you closer to the heart of fascism. Because the heart of fascism was to identify the party with the state. That's what happened under Mussolini. In Germany, the Nazi party became the state. And that's what the Democrats want. They would like to have all these supposedly neutral agencies, the IRS, the FBI, the CIA, the Justice Department, do their political bidding. Go after our enemies, lock them up. So this is fascism, or a streak of fascism, and it's not coming from the right, it's coming entirely from the left. But now I want to talk a little bit about racism. Now, and I want to talk about the Democrats' two get-out-of-jail-free cards. The Democratic Party has never acknowledged that it is the party of slavery, of segregation, of Jim Crow, of the Ku Klux Klan, of racial terrorism. They have never acknowledged what the progressive scholar Eric Foner says, which is the KKK was for decades, quote, the domestic terrorist arm of the Democratic Party, end quote. They have never acknowledged that it was Democrats, not Republicans, who were the main source of opposition to the civil rights laws in the 60s. They have never acknowledged that more Republicans proportionately voted for those laws than Democrats. They have never acknowledged that if the Democratic Party was the only party in Congress, none of those laws, not the Civil Rights Act of 1964, not the Voting Rights Act of 1965, not the Fair Housing Bill of 1968, would have passed. They acknowledge none of this, and they lie to you about it in your classrooms. You don't know it because they haven't taught it to you. I don't blame you, I blame them. They've acknowledged none of it. But to get out of jail free, when you force them to acknowledge it, they will say, oh, but the party switched sides, driven by tricky Richard Nixon. The Southern strategy, Dinesh, haven't you heard of it? Every reasonable person knows the party switched sides. So I want to look at that for a moment. Did the party switch sides? Let's check it out. Abraham Lincoln, in defining slavery, said the following: slavery can be reduced to a simple slogan: you work, I eat. That's slavery. It's theft. You're stealing another guy's labor. But the key point is that Lincoln said that this is the credo not of the South, but of the Democratic Party in the North and the South. Stealing and confiscating the fruits of somebody else's labor is their thing. And as for Republicans, according to Lincoln, they stand for the opposite. And what's the opposite? In Lincoln's words, the hand that makes the corn has the right to eat the corn. In other words, people have a right to keep the fruits of what they earn. And there we go. Let's fast forward now 150 years, and I ask you, is it not a fact that today, if the Republican Party has a single core principle at the middle of it, it is the idea that the hand that makes the corn has the right to put the corn into its own mouth. That is still what we Republicans believe, which means we are the party of Lincoln right now. And as for the Democrats, yes, as my movie shows, they've gone from one theft scheme to another, true, but the bottom line of it is if you had to sum up what they do, and it's in a new form today than it was before, but wouldn't you agree that the principle of the Democratic Party, even now, is the idea that one guy gets to work and another guy takes the fruits of his labor and disposes of it as the Democrats see fit. Even now, the Democrats stand for the simple principle, the odious principle, you work, I eat. That's their credo even now. Now, Nixon's Southern strategy. Here are the problems with it. Nixon has supposedly went and courted the votes of the racist Deep South, except nobody has ever supplied a single public racist campaign statement by Richard M. Nixon. It doesn't exist. And so progressive historians like Kevin Cruz at Princeton, they go, well, Dinesh, you're kind of oversimplifying. Nixon didn't really make any racist statements, but what he did is some racist dog whistles. Dog whistles. I mean, let's think about this. The basic idea here is that Richard Nixon spoke to the Southern racists in a kind of code. He made dog noises, and the racists, being dogs, have this heightened awareness of messages indecipherable to the media and the rest of the country. On the face of it, this is a little whacked. But let's concede it. What are these dog whistles? And basically the left answers two: law and order and drugs. And these are code words for racism. Now, you know, if you were talking after Ferguson, Missouri, and so on, you could have an argument. But in 1968, the big issue in America was the Vietnam War. And when Nixon said drugs and law and order, he was talking about the LSD-smoking hippies like Timothy Leary, and he was talking about the left-wing anti-war rioters, people like Bill Ayers and Abby Hoffman, the people who had disrupted the Democratic Convention. And he was talking about draft dodgers and lawbreakers who went to Canada because they were too cowardly to face the draft. Now, my wife and I actually had lunch with Bill Ayers and his wife, the fellow domestic terrorist Bernadine Dorn. And last time we checked, they both were white. In other words, Nixon was not making a racial appeal at all. Now, when Nixon was elected in 1969, what's one of the first things he did that year? Answer. He implemented America's first affirmative action program. Legal preferences for blacks over whites. So think about it. Would a guy who's courting a racist base in the Deep South, does it make any sense to do as one of his first actions to implement legal policies, the beginning of all American affirmative action, that discriminate in favor of blacks and against whites? That's absurd. Nixon lost the Deep South. The Deep South was actually won by Democratic segregationist George Wallace. And what about those racist Dixiecrats who supposedly became Republicans? When the Princeton historian Cruz lists Dixiecrats, he's very cunning. He goes, well, of course, Jesse Helms was a Democrat. He became a Republican. Trent Lott was a Democrat. He became a Republican. John Tower was a Democrat. He became a Republican, except none of those three men were Dixiecrats. So if you want to have an argument, let's stay on the same plane. In reality, if you make a list of Dixiecrats, about 200 of them, governors, senators, congressmen, let's just look at the Congress. In the entire Senate of all the Dixiecrats, only one guy switched, Strom Thurmond. In the entire Congress, in the House, only one guy switched, Albert Watson. That's 2 out of 200. The rest of the Dixiecrats stayed and died in the Democratic Party and were lionized in the Democratic Party. There are buildings in Washington, D.C. right here named after them. That's a fact. So now I turn in conclusion to what I call the Democrats' last hope, their last refuge, and their last refuge is Charlottesville. Charlottesville. And the argument, well, you can see it. They were so delighted with Charlottesville, not the tragedy of Charlottesville, somebody was killed there, that's a tragedy, but they were delighted ideologically. Why? Because they're able to say, hey, there are the neo-Nazis and KKK guys in Trump hats. So racism now is obviously on the right. Who can argue with it? There it is on TV. Now, first of all, you've got to be a little careful with the on-TV argument because, frankly, no one has ever done an empirical survey of neo-Nazis and white supremacists or Klansmen to figure out if they actually voted for Trump. There's simply no data on this point. And with TV, you have to realize there's staging going on. At one point, I remember turning on a video and I see this solitary white supremacist. I mean, a ridiculous guy. An imbecile. Quite frankly, I think if that guy actually lived in Nazi Germany, Hitler would have sent him straight to the gas chambers. But nevertheless, there he is. And he's surrounded by like 30 reporters. 30 reporters covering one white supremacist. Why? Because that's their point. There's the Trumpster. There's white supremacy. What I do in my book is I actually look at all the leading white nationalists in America, one by one by one. And I show that almost without exception, they are all men, mostly men, of the left. Of the left. Jason Kessler, the main organizer of Charlottesville, Obama activist, Occupy Wall Street guy. Ask yourself, why would an Obama activist, an Obama voter, become a white supremacist? Does that make any sense? It makes no sense. Now, the press knew this. It's on the Southern Poverty Law Center website. But the press suppressed it. Why? Because it's inconvenient to their Charlottesville narrative. Now, a Charlottesville paper actually interviewed Jason Kessler's friends. They discover a deep history of leftism. This guy's an atheist. In fact, his girlfriend, kind of amusingly, she goes, he broke up with me because he called me too conservative. The girlfriend was not liberal enough for Jason. When I pointed this out on social media, Jason Kessler makes a video attacking me, but in the video he also attacks the rich, the bankers. It's pretty obvious the guy's still a leftist. And in the movie, and you'll see this, you've got to see the movie this weekend, by the way. It opens today. And quite frankly, if you want to know how do you help, see the movie now. Because the fate of a movie depends on the opening weekend. If we do well in this weekend, our movie will explode into more theaters. It'll reach more people. It'll have more of an impact in November. This movie will make you a very dangerous American. But in the movie, I interviewed the poster boy of white supremacy, Richard Spencer. And we've released a short clip of this in the media already. I say to Richard Spencer, do you believe that all men are created equal? No. Do you believe in individual rights? No. Do you believe our rights come from God? No. Where do our rights come from? They come from the state. And you begin to realize that this is a guy who believes in the large, centralized state. So of course there's a streak of fascism here because the fascists believe in the all-powerful centralized state. I ask him, what do you think of Reagan? Not a great president. Who are your favorite presidents? And then he lists a bunch of Democrats. Andrew Jackson, Polk. I go, they're Democrats. He goes, well, parties, what do party labels matter? I go, well, Andrew Jackson's the founder of the Democratic Party. And so here you have this eye-opening narrative unfolding before your eyes. Notice that the media is staying away from this. Why? It destroys their Charlottesville narrative. It exposes them as frauds. It shows that fake news is built on fake history and fake scholarship. And that's where you come in. Because at the end of the day, knowledge is allied to the news of the day. If you want to be a powerful activist now, you need to know something about American history and about American political culture. Now, Abraham Lincoln said, the fiery trial through which we pass will light us in honor or in dishonor down to the latest generation. And what Lincoln means is that at the end of the day, we're in a big fight. That was true of his time, and that's true of our time. It's a fight in which we are all, perhaps by tragic necessity, necessary participants, and you have a role to play. And your role is to use your influence, to expand your knowledge, to become what I sometimes call a very dangerous American. The death of America is not an inevitability. But it does loom on the horizon unless we act to stop it. I believe we are fully up to the task. Won't you join me, if you will, in a campaign, in a crusade, if I may say so, to save this America we know and love. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.